Hi, I'm delighted to introduce retired United States Navy Captain Tom Spink. Tom was a naval flight officer and became a flight instructor at Moffett Field. Upon retirement, Tom rose to become the commanding officer of the Reserve Patrol Squadron 91 at Moffett. In 2022, Tom became chairman of the board of the Moffett Field Historical Society and Museum. Tom's exceptional background provides him with a wealth of knowledge on the exceptional and interesting history of Moffett Field, which he is going to share with us. Let's give Tom a very warm welcome.
Thank you, thank you. I hope I can live up to the hype. So yeah, he said, I arrived at Moffett Field in 1970, a 25-year-old kid from Kansas, and I spent most of my adult life there, and active in reserve, and also worked in a lot of defense companies, ending up at Lockheed, working on a military communications satellite called Milstar. And then after I retired, I started volunteering at the Moffett Museum, and when the president started having some medical problems, I looked around and I had 50 years worth of history at Moffett, so I raised my hand and volunteered to be president, and that's when it was easier being commanding officer of a Navy squadron than it was leading a bunch of volunteers. Anyway, but getting back to the history of Moffett Field, which again, this is our logo is kind of from lighter than air with dirigibles and blimps, and I'll explain that, to faster than sound. NASA Ames developed a lot of different aircraft, some of which went into production, and then of course outer space. Right now, NASA Ames focus is to return to the moon and on to Mars, and that's what they're focusing on right now. Next slide. Sunnyvale. Yes, I live in Sunnyvale, and you know, back in the day, it was just nothing but orchards, and orchards as far as you could see. And I think there's only one left. I remember his first name, and it's Olson. And he's got one small cherry orchard left, and I buy cherries, I think it's every spring. Next slide. So after World War I, there was a group of civilians that realized that America was no longer protected by two oceans, because there was a country, aka Germany, that had ships and submarines that could pose us a threat. And so they raised half $500,000 during the Depression in the South Bay and sold it to the Navy for $1, with the understanding that the Navy would build a base for observation craft. Now, in those days, it was bi-wing airplanes and blimps. Now, a blimp is just a gas bag with a gondola underneath it. But next slide. So that's Laurel Whipple, and if you're familiar with the peninsula, there's a Whipple Avenue up in Redwood City. But this is when they were putting together the purchase of the land. Next slide. So they're going to build a base from 1931 to 1933. They're going to build a base for observation craft. Well, in those days, we got reparations from Germany. You remember they had the Graf Zeppelin and the Hindenburg that were flying people from Europe to South America in luxury and everything. And so we got the technology from them to build 4 different dirigibles. Now, the first two, the Shenandoah and the Los Angeles, were just a huge dirigible. And I think my dad told me that one passed over Kansas City when he was a kid. But then they also built 2 more. The Akron was going to be to cover the Atlantic Fleet, and the Macon was going to cover the Pacific Fleet. Now, these large dirigibles, 785 feet long, crew of 78 people, could stay up a month. And of course, this is before radar, so they're out in front of the fleet looking for bad guys, And they were also an airborne aircraft carrier. They could lower down these small bi-wing airplane called Sparrowhawks and release them, and they could extend that visual range another 100 miles. And to house the Macon, they built what we call the iconic Hangar 1. That's what it looked like in 1933, and that's what it looked like about 2 years ago. Next slide. So they built the base from 31 to 33, and I saw a presentation a couple of years ago, and Hangar 1's going to look just like that in a couple of more years. They're putting new skin on it. I got a picture towards the end of what it looked like last week. And again, so then, let's see, 31 to 33, next slide. So, unfortunately, the Navy had a visionary, and his name was Admiral William Moffett. He wasn't a pilot, he was actually a ship driver that did a really heroic action in World War I and earned the Medal of Honor. But he was a visionary, and he tried to tell Navy brass that aviation was going to be a big part of the Navy. And the Army had its visionary, and his name was Billy Mitchell. Okay, so unfortunately, the Akron was to cover the Atlantic Fleet. It crashed in 33 off the New Jersey coast, and Admiral Moffett was aboard. And 8 days later, they commissioned Naval Air Station Sunnyvale, and to honor him, they also call it Moffett Field, and that name remains till today. Next slide. So the Macon arrives at Moffett in October of 33. It's 785 feet long, and like I said, a crew of 78, and it had these small Sparrowhawk aircraft that they would lower down out of the hangar bay, release them, could extend the visual range another 100 miles, and they'd come back, and they'd have to catch that trapeze. Now, my understanding was, because I was a navigator, I understand it was a very tricky maneuver where they'd have to do a zoom climb and then catch that trapeze. I never heard of anybody going swimming, and when they get way out over the water, too far away to go back to land, they'd take those wheels off and put a gas tank underneath it. So you had to be committed to come back to the mothership. So this picture, it shows its intended purpose. It would be out in front of a line of ships. And we have this picture at the museum. You'll notice that the Golden Gate Bridge is not complete. So the iron workers that built Hangar 1 out of metal in 31 to 33, when they were done, they went on to build the Golden Gate Bridge. Well, the Macon crashes in 35, so we're pretty sure that picture is 1934. Oh, and the logo in the upper left-hand corner is obviously not politically correct. It would never make it through the censors today. But that's the way the trapeze was depicted in that day. Next slide. So unfortunately, in February of 1935, the Macon was off Big Sur, and she ran into a thunderstorm, and she settled by the stern, and one person was lost. They jumped from the control car when it was too high, and another person, after it settled into the water, got out but went back in, we think for their logbook or something, and they were dragged down. National Geographic went down and photographed the wreckage site, and there's, in the top one right there is a picture of a couple of those Sparrowhawk aircraft on the floor of the sea. It's off the Big Sur coast, and it's a protected area now. Next slide. So with both of the dirigibles lost to Mother Nature, even though they were a rigid airship, it had a metal skeleton, Mother Nature was stronger. The base turns over to the Army Air Corps. You got to remember, this is, Air Force doesn't come into being until 47. So it's the U.S. Army Air Corps and Moffett Field. And of course that name stakes till today. They trained hundreds of pilots between about 1937 and 42. In that airplane to the lower left, it's a BT-13, a basic trainer 13. We have a very nice example of that in our small air park. To the right there, Jimmy Stewart, skinny young man, arrives at Moffett to learn how to fly. was a bomber pilot in Europe, and then stays in the service, becomes the Air Force in 47, and he stays in the Air Force Reserve and retires as a one-star brigadier general. Next slide. So in 39, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, Ames Research Laboratory starts, and they start building a series of wind tunnels in order to develop new aircraft. Next slide. And they've got about 6 or 8 wind tunnels. In the upper right there shows the large wind tunnel that a full-size aircraft, like an F-18, can go inside there. And some of those other models are full size, and others are just models. Next slide. So with both of the with December 7th, we're pulled into World War II. Next slide. So the base turns back to the Navy, and it goes back to its original purpose of being an observation craft. And what flew out of Moffett during the war was 2 classes of blimps, an L class that had 2 people, could stay up a couple of days, and a K class that had 10 people and could stay up about a week. There was a series of 13 bases from San Diego to Oregon, and they built a series of wood hangars during the war. And a lot of the bases had 2 hangars, and like Moffett, it's got hangar 2 and 3 that are over on the far side of the field. But these K-class and L-class blimps were motorized. They could, they were very steerable. They could even fly in formation. Next slide. So they built the wood hangars during the war, and this is hangars 2 on the left and 3 on the right. Now, because I'm showing that picture, I'll jump ahead a little bit and tell you about the worst kept top secret going on over there. In the hangar 2 on the left-hand side for the last 3 years, one of the Google principals, Sergey Brin, has been building a 400-foot dirigible in there, and it just rolled out about a month ago. The FAA's given them permission to start doing some flight testing, and so the people developing that called LTA Research, and you can look it up, and they'll show you pictures of the whole development. LTA Research. Most of them have already moved to Akron, Ohio, and they're going to build 2 more. They're going to be used for humanitarian purposes, like if a village is isolated from because of a typhoon, they'll be able to lift food and medicine into that village, because this 400-foot dirigible can lift more than a heavy lift helicopter. Okay, and unfortunately, Hangar 3, because of lack of maintenance, it's got a swale going, and so they're going to tear it down, but not before NASA and Google funded a documentary of which I was honored to be part of, and it's going to be on the NASA website in the next couple of months. But they wanted me to talk about what it was like as a young lieutenant, living and working inside that hangar, and it was a real honor to be part of that. Next slide. So during Korea, there were transport planes at Moffett that, in addition to fighters, that took needed equipment over to Korea and brought injured soldiers back to the hospitals. That was the transport era. Next slide. So we started the Korean War with prop planes, and what came back were jets. Now the carriers were all up at Alameda, but there wasn't enough room for all the squadrons, so there were 22 jet squadrons that were at Moffett. And there were notables that were in those squadrons, like Wally Schirra, one of the early astronauts, and Jim Lovell, who went to the moon twice. They both lived and worked down at Moffett. Next slide. This is an example of some of the jets that were at Moffett. It turns out that, and I only learned this about a year ago, that Moffett was the Navy's first master jet base in '53. But like I said, I'm sure the people in the Santa Clara Valley didn't shed a tear, you know, when all of a sudden in 1962, the attack aircraft moved to a base down in the Central Valley called Lemoore, and the fighters moved down to Miramar. Next slide. So in 58, NACA becomes NASA, NASA Ames, and of course they developed a lot of different aircraft. Only a few actually went into production. In the upper right is the F-100 that started the 100 series, the 100, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the one on the upper left, I think they only built a couple of those, but we have a picture in our museum of Neil Armstrong. This was a vertical takeoff and landing airplane, and he practiced landing on the moon in that aircraft. All right, the first one I understand he punched out of, and but then he went back and was brave enough to get in the second one and was practicing landings. Obviously, the one in the lower right never got produced, but I think that's an F-8 Bearcat in the lower left. So, next slide. So, in 1960, the Air Force Satellite Tracking Center, AKA the Blue Cube, comes to the valley, and it's right next to Moffett. And the interesting thing about that is that, whoops, oh my goodness, his finger slipped. The interesting thing about that was, in the early days, the spy satellites, the downlink were not encrypted, and you'd have to have an antenna that big in order to capture it, right? So they figured that the enemy's not going to be able to build an antenna like that big, or be noticeable, so they weren't worried about it. And the other thing is so the Blue Cube was torn down a few years ago, and they came to the Moffett Museum and said, hey, could you do an exhibit for the Blue Cube once they start declassifying some of this stuff? And we just didn't have the room. But luckily, I was just at over at the Sunnyvale Heritage Museum, and they are building a 1,600-foot extension onto their museum, and it's going to be dedicated to the Blue Cube. And I've talked to a lot of the Blue Cube alumni, and anyway, I think it's going to be fantastic. Next. So this is just some of the companies that grew up around Moffett during the Cold War. You know, as we all know, the South Bay here has been a hotbed for technology, from civilian-related stuff to military-related stuff. I just remember back during the Cold War days, and I've worked for a couple of those companies, there were a lot of buildings in the valley with no windows, because during the Cold War they were stuffing equipment in any kind of vehicle in order to try and get information. Next slide. So after I did a fleet tour where you train for 12 months and then deploy for 6 months to Japan or Okinawa or the Philippines, I was selected to be an instructor, navigation instructor at Moffett. The training squadron was called the Patrol Squadron 31, and it was in the big hangar. On the west side of the hangar was the ground school. You'd have individual training. The pilots got their training, the navigators, the radar operators, the acoustic operators, and then you come over to the flight side, and they taught you how to fly as a crew and do the various missions that the P-3 would do. There was called a multi-mission aircraft. You could find people fishing in the wrong area, polluting, whatever, but of course the main job during the Cold War was we watched the Russians and the Russians watched us. And of course it was also a very well designed airplane for tracking submarines. Next slide. So these were the 7 active duty squadrons, and then the reserve squadron was in the lower right. So after I left the training squadron, I got off active duty and I was in the reserve squadron for 11 years, didn't get caught doing anything bad, and actually had the honor of being a commanding officer. Next slide. The 129th Rescue Squadron. Can't say enough about these guys. Went to a change of command over there, and all of a sudden I saw 800 people. I went, what's going on? Well, you have a C-130 squadron, you have an H-60 squadron, you have the paramedics, you have the logistics, you have the maintenance, and when you put all those different groups together, it ends up being a wing, actually. I'm going to have to change that. Well, it's in the logo, a wing of 800 people, and they have over 1,000 saves to their credit. They've got all kinds of cool toys. They can rescue you whether you're in the mountains or hundreds of miles out to sea. I saw a jet ski that they had widened so it could operate in 6 inches of water. I mean, they've really got some cool stuff. Next slide. 1994, the active duty leaves, the reserves stay a couple more years till 1999, my old squadron, and it becomes Moffett Federal Air Base. Basically, there was these things called BRAC, Base Realignment and Closure. Moffett was never closed, it was realigned because the 129th was still there, okay? A lot of bases closed completely, but not Moffett, it was realigned. Next slide. And the Blue Cube was renamed Onizuka Air Force Base after Colonel Onizuka, who was killed in one of the shuttle accidents. Next slide. So in 2010, Hangar 1 decontamination project begins. Basically, there were 3, I'm not giving you the finger, there were two layers of metal with a layer of felt in between as a cushion, and that felt was impregnated with PCBs. Now, PCBs were invented in the 30s as a fire retardant. Nobody knew they were a carcinogen until about 15 years ago. So, and there was lead, and there was other bad things in there. But anyway, they wanted to get rid of all that. A lot of us said, hey, nobody's gotten sick or died in 70 years. Why mess with it? But we lost that battle. So fine. So they took it off. So I said, okay, fine. All right, we're going to get new skin. So now Google is putting new skin on. Next slide. And before then I forgot about, that's a picture of the 400-foot long dirigible that Sergey Brin is building that came out about a month ago, and it's really something. Go ahead. So Hangar 1's going to look like that in by 2025. Next slide. So this was a picture from last week. On the left is the new skin. Again, I've asked the project manager to come over and give us a presentation and even maybe give us some documentation on it. Again, it has, what I've seen happening is it's 2 layers of metal with a layer in between. And but I don't understand all the technical parts, and we're hoping that we can get a technical briefing. Next slide. What's underneath the white plastic is they are sandblasting. When they took the skin off, all they did was pressure wash it. Well, some I don't know, I can't be political. Can't be political. Some of you may have sons or daughters that are bureaucrats. Anyway, I saw it in print that 1/10 of 1% bad stuff might still have been on there. So they're going to make Google spend like $30 million, and they're sandblasting off the acrylic coating, and they're going to sandblast the old acrylic coating and the 1/10 of 1% of the pollutants and put more, and they're going to put more acrylic coating on it. And so that's what's going on under the plastic. They've got big vacuums that are making sure that it doesn't escape out into the air and everything. But anyway, so again, they'll probably be done by about 2025. Oh, and then what's going to happen? Nobody knows. Google isn't talking to us. We've heard unofficially that we might be invited to go into Hangar 1. It's as big as 9 football fields. We would only need about 1/13th. And my 30-second elevator speech to anybody that comes through the museum is that 40 years ago, people realized the Navy was going to leave Hangar 1, and they drew up plans for an Air and Space Museum that I think the people in this valley would really like to see Hangar 1 become. And so, and I think it's taken so long to do this that if Google doesn't have anything really that they want to do in there, turn it into Smithsonian Air and Space West, because Smithsonian doesn't have anything to the west of the Mississippi, I think west of the Alleghenies. And the thing is, I saw a presentation where the Smithsonian will give you artifacts, airplanes and stuff like that, but that you have to provide a shell. Well, in 2 years, that's going to be a perfect shell. Okay, next slide. So for 90 years, Moffett served this country, both with dirigibles, and then blimps, and then jets, and then the patrol aircraft. Next slide. And we're right there by the southwest corner of Big Hangar 1, and we're open Wednesday through Saturday, 10 to 3, with a minimal admission charge. And we hope that you all would come visit. Next slide. Next slide. And we've got a small air park outside. Some of those pictures show the inside. We've got an air park that has a U-2 that was a spy plane. It's got a tail hook on it. Then it was NASA high altitude research. And then we've got a BT-13 like the one that Jimmy Stewart learned to fly in. We've got a 104 and an Army helicopter and an F-18 that was a Blue Angel. Next slide. Any questions? No questions? Oh, yes, sir.
I used to hear that sometimes it rains and so it's kind of minimizes that rain.
Well, it's really condensation. When I was a 25-year-old kid, I got there and I was actually standing duty in there one night and a cold front passed through and the petty officer said, "Hey, Lieutenant, come on out here and look." And yeah, there were drops coming down, but it's condensation from when a cold front would pass through, and they're not going to make the top black. I heard that they made the top black to prevent the condensation, but for some reason they're going to go back to the way it was originally, and I think maybe they've figured out the condensation problem some other way.
Yeah, I hope they put some kind of air conditioning or something, because I've been in it when it was raining.
Yes, sir.
The blimps that went out in World War II, did they have something to destroy the submarines with when they were out?
They did. Matter of fact, thank you. It was almost like I scripted that. Back when they were cleaning out Hangar 1, they found the nose and the tail of a K ship, K-22, that crashed in the foothills in the fog. And so we've hired a welding company in San Jose, and they're are connecting the back and the front, and they're reconstructing a K-ship gondola, 42 feet long, 18 feet high, and 11 feet wide. We also have a lot of the equipment that would have been in that K-ship. There was radar, there was MAD, it had depth charges to kill a submarine, and I believe actually they might have even had some sonobuoys and a sonobuoy receiver. But like I said, we have a cradle out in our air park, and we think we're going to get that in a couple more months. And we think there's only 3 of these K-ship gondolas, and they're all on the East Coast, and we'll have the only one on the West Coast. And when I give tours, the executive director's chair is right behind that exhibit, and I keep saying that this project, well, because we started it before the pandemic, and so during the pandemic, the labor and the material costs doubled and tripled. So I keep saying that this project's either going to bankrupt us or put us on the map. And he's on the other side there, and he goes, "Oh, Tom." And so I do believe it will put us on the map when we get this thing through. You, sir.
When you went in service,
When I got out of advanced nav school, the only thing I trusted was celestial navigation. We have a map on the wall close to what I call the most important exhibit in the museum. It's dedicated to the airborne overwater navigators, which is what I was. And we have the nav pubs. We have a periscopic sextant. I used to stand on my chair, on the nav chair, stick it up through the top of the P3 and shoot the stars. There's a huge area if you're going from Hawaii to Japan, that Loran didn't get out there. It would only go out 500 to 1,000 miles. There's a huge area out there in the Pacific where the only thing you had in those days was celestial. It's the only thing, because I always said, hey, the Loran could blow a fuse. That was, I loved shooting the stars. Oh, yes, sir. But like I said, it's called something called a periscopic sextant. It punches up through a hole in the top of the airplane. And then, you do the pre-computation, you get up, you shoot each body for 2 minutes, post-computation, and then you plot it on the chart, and it shows you exactly where you were 20 minutes ago, and you're going 250 miles an hour.
Right.
So you had to keep moving.
Yes. Very good. Other questions, Victor?
Oh, okay.
How many hangars are still left?
I'm sorry, what?
How many hangars do you still have on Moffett?
We still have 2 3/4. They just started taking Hangar 3 down. They started with the doors. I just saw a picture a couple days ago. I think they've taken the skin off of the south door, but yeah, they're going to take it down. There's a big swale. If you go over to play golf, there's a big swale in the middle of Hangar 3. They moved scaffolding in there, and every time they would try and fix this board, another board would fall. And they'd fix that board, and then that board. They finally decided, okay, it's beyond economical repair. Now they fixed up Hangar 2 prior to them building that dirigible in there. So I think Hangar 2 is going to be around a while. Yeah, so we have 1 and 2 now. You probably all heard about a similar hangar in Tustin burning down about 6 months ago. That thing had burned for months because it's all wood, and they wouldn't even fight it. And then another one burned down up in Tillamook. They had 2 up there. One of them burned down. The guy came down and briefed me on that, and he says, "You're not going to believe it, but somebody was storing hay in a wooden hangar." When that thing lit off, there was no stopping it. Yes, sir.
Yes, this thing that Google is building, is that something that is really needed, or is it just somebody's ego trip?
I think I kind of intimated that after spending some unknown amount of tens of millions of dollars for a personal conveyance, that he's covering his public relations butt by building 2 more that are going to be used for humanitarian purposes. Now, you didn't hear that from me, right? But that's what I think is going on. Yes, sir.
Could you expand on the moving the Smithsonian away from the Smithsonian?
That's just my pipe dream. So this making Hangar 1 into Smithsonian Air and Space West. Again, I said there were plans drawn up 40 years ago. For those of you that have been to Udvar-Hazy at the Dulles Airport, the plans that I saw drawn up were like that. You would, where my museum is and our little air park would be a 2-story garage, and you would enter on the second level, and you'd look down on the floor full of airplanes. And that's the way Udvar-Hazy is at the Dulles Airport. We've started making inroads into Google, and I've got an idea to maybe talk to the guy who's in charge of Smithsonian back in Washington, D.C., but I think, like I said, it's a pipe dream right now, but it's what I'd love to see, and I think that's what the people in this valley would like to see. Yes, sir.
Not sure if it's urban legend or maybe it's NSA. Is it true that there's nuclear residuals still at Moffett?
I've never heard about residuals, and I'll be glad to tell you, yeah, we had nuclear weapons, but it was worthless because what happened was if everybody wanted to be nuclear capable because that got you money, okay? And so in the early days, they actually had an idea to take a P-2, which is a great big patrol plane. They were going to put a P-2 because it was the only thing big enough to hold the nuclear bomb. The early nuclear bombs were so big, the only thing that would hold it was the P-2. They were going to put it on an aircraft carrier, but that was a one-way mission. It wasn't coming back to the carrier. And so then as the nuclear bombs got smaller and smaller, we used to load what was called a shape, you know, but it was a worthless weapon because if you dropped it and missed that submarine, you put so much noise in the water, you were never going to catch him again. And the other thing that happened was the acquisition range on the homing torpedo got greater than the kill range on the nuke. So that's why I say it was a worthless weapon. And, but yeah, but there were nukes there back then, but I don't know about any about residual. Huh? Oh, I don't know that either. I saw something about these forever chemicals. Yeah, I think they're everywhere. Yes, sir.
Yes, do you have very much history about the testing of the J-58 engines up at Moffett Field on the A-12, the SR-71 early variant? Understand that Lockheed spent an awful lot of time confirming how to configure the ducting on the engine so that plane would fly Mach 3 plus. Do you have any data on that?
Not that I know of, but you might come to the museum and talk to our executive director. His name is Jeff Wassel, W-A-S-E-L. He might know a little bit. I have not heard anything about anything to do with SR-71 at Moffett. I mean, it might have been over at NASA. They've got supersonic wind tunnels, and like I said, I just worked on this one satellite program at Lockheed, and I never heard of anything over at least at Lockheed Sunnyvale.
Thank you. Is there any other questions? Let's wrap up.
Up.
Wow, good.
Yes, sir.
Okay, just a personal note, for your information. I have two twin sisters that, my dad was in the Air Force. He retired and he lived in San Jose. Two twin sisters were born in 1963, and they had nowhere to send them except for Moffett. So when my mom was pregnant, so she shows up at Moffett, and there was only medics there, no doctors. So she walks in, she's pregnant with twins, and they said, "You can't stay here. This is not a hospital. You can't live these babies." Well, the babies came, and they made history because they were the only babies born in Moffett. Wow. So they're historic.
Thank you.
Put that in the museum.
If I ever get asked that question, now I know the answer.
There you go. Excellent. Thank you.
Wait, was it? Yes, sir.
I remember when the P-3 and another plane collided out there.
Yeah. The President's plane, Air Force One, occasionally back during the Clinton era, of course, Chelsea was going to Stanford. He'd come on a regular basis to see his daughter. I've seen it. It was there for Biden. Oh, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago. But they don't let we're only given notice about a day or two ahead of time that he's coming, and they won't let anybody get close. They won't even let us stand outside the south end of our museum because we can see the airplane. So, but I remember the first time that Obama was coming. They had taken the skin off of Hangar 1. The Secret Service shows up, a couple weeks ahead of time, and I knew the guy who was going to work with him over with the base security, and the Secret Service looked at Hangar 1, with no skin. And they went, we're not coming. Too many places for a sniper to hide. So they didn't even come to Moffett back then. So you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, I think That should be a take. Thank you.
One last
very
guy.
mu- One last one? Okay, go for it.
You mentioned P2s, those P3s were so much more comfortable. Often the tail end to the cockpit on the P3s.
Yeah, the P2, the wing went all the way through, and there's a book written by a guy I know called Coffee on the Wing Beam. So the galley was in the back. If a pilot asked for a cup of coffee, the guy would, in the back, would put it on the wing, and he'd yell up, he said, okay, the coffee's on the wing beam, and they better grab that cup before they'd make any maneuvers. Of course, the P3 had a galley in the back. We had an oven. Interesting thing, the oven was about this wide, about that tall. It was perfect for TV dinners, because that's when it was designed. It was designed in the late 50s, it started being built in the early 60s. TV dinners would fit in there perfectly. If you took the rack out, you could cook something else, like a half a turkey breast, which I did on. My crew did on Thanksgiving flying off Vietnam. But we had a refrigerator, a big thing that would hold hot coffee, and we had a couple of plugs that you could have an electric fry pan and a toaster. You could go over to and bring what they call unprepareds on there and cook a full meal on a 10 or 12 hour flight, because that was the average off of Vietnam and stuff like that. During the Cold War, the average flight was 10 or 12 hours. But thank you all very, very much.
Well, thank you.